This program is brought to you with support from the U.S. EPA. We're here to present the EFC Network podcast. The Environmental Finance Center Network is a partnership of 12 centers serving 10 EPA regions. The EFCN provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems. This podcast series has been designed to help system personnel improve technical, managerial, and financial capacity of the utilities and communities they serve.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I am your host, Mikhail Schlemp. I am a project assistant at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center and a graduate student specializing in water resource engineering and snow hydrology in the Civil Engineering Department at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. Today, we will be talking to you about snow, how snow is changing in light of warming temperatures and increasing climate variance, and what this might mean for small drinking water systems around the country. For many communities around the world, snow is life. It is the water they drink and the food they eat. More than 1/6 of the world's population relies on snowmelt water for agriculture and consumption. The United States is no exception to this. In California, for example, more than 70% of water from the San Joaquin River, which is fed by snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada mountains, is used to irrigate the Central Valley. This water is not only crucial for food security, it also carries a massive economic price tag. For example, the snow from the Sierra Nevada mountains cumulatively sustains a $47 billion per year agricultural industry in California alone. Unfortunately, climate change is causing our snow resources to rapidly change at a regional and global scale. And with it, the communities and businesses that depend on this snow are being forced to adapt. Although these changes affect both small and large communities alike, small communities can face some unique challenges. This is especially true for small mountain communities, whose drinking water systems are often directly fed by snowmelt from surrounding basins. These small systems can be especially sensitive to both changes in the distribution of snow, since they may depend on snowmelt from a small number of basins, and changes in the timing of snowmelt, since they may not have access to a reservoir for snowmelt storage. They may also lack the access to instrumentation and technical expertise required to monitor how their snow resources are changing year to year. Together, these factors can make it particularly difficult for small systems to create effective climate resiliency strategies. Joining me to talk more about this topic is Dr. Ryan Webb. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Architectural Engineering and Construction Management at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. His research group focuses on how snow and rain produce stream flow, groundwater recharge, and soil moisture storage in mountain environments. Thanks for joining me today, Ryan.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So there are a lot of areas around the world that depend heavily on snow water as a resource. These areas typically receive most of their annual precipitation as snow during the winter and do not get sufficient rainfall during the spring and summer alone to meet human demand. Can you give us a bit of a better sense of where in the United States this is the case and how much these areas rely on snow for water?
Sure. So really in the majority of the Western United States, and it's not even just the mountainous areas. Well, the mountains tend to be where the snow really builds up and then melts off for the runoff. Even in areas down in southern New Mexico, you get a lot of your flow in the river, like the Rio Grande, from that snow melt. So that can be about 2/3 of the river is from that snow melt up in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. And really in the western US, the vast majority of water that's in our rivers that recharges our aquifers are from snow melt, especially when we look at reservoirs like Lake Powell or something that's, about 70% of that comes from snow melt up in the Colorado River.
Cool. Wow. Yeah, that's huge. So despite this importance of snow water, I think sometimes maybe it can be hard for some people, especially if they live in communities that are, well downstream of mountainous areas where that snow is falling. I think it can be hard for some people to make that connection between snow and the water coming out of their taps. I know you have done a lot of research on the different pathways that snow melt water can take. Can you describe a bit more about the process through which snow becomes water in streams or aquifers that eventually feeds drinking water systems for communities?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's absolutely something that is sometimes difficult to convey. Most people just want to go turn on their tap and get water and don't really think about where that water's coming from or how it gets there. But ultimately, snowmelt, it has a bunch of different pathways that it can take from the mountains to our rivers and reservoirs, but in general, it all will feed into the ground somehow. So I do a lot of small scale research where we kind of look at how much or how far will the water flow through the snow before it interacts with the ground. But when we start to look at these larger scale basins and watersheds that feed into these communities, it all will eventually get into the ground, and that groundwater will then slowly release through the summer. And when you get down into those lower basin areas, the river starts to recharge the aquifers. So even those sort of lowland areas where you might not get a huge snowpack during the winter, you still get a lot of those aquifers getting recharged from the water in the rivers that came from snowmelt. And so that's tends to be the main sources of water for communities that rely on a snowpack. Whether it's the river or ground, it all tends to come from snow.
Interesting. So given the processes that you just described, can you explain why water that is supplied by snowmelt as opposed to water from rain, for example, is particularly crucial at generating usable water for many communities?
Sure. So I think a lot of that has to do with how the winter snowpack builds up over the entire winter, over the season. So you get all of that precipitation is just sort of accumulating and then melting in a relatively quick time period. So the snow melt season is actually, depending on where you are and how deep the snow is, a couple to a few weeks long. So when you get that much water melting and trying to infiltrate into the ground over a short period of time, it's just more than that ground can take. So it has to release it somewhere. And it tends to just run off more quickly, or it creates this stronger pressure from all that water to have a stronger force in which to recharge the groundwater resources. And then if you get rain, it tends to be, smaller amounts, intermittent. It's common in the Western U.S. to have these afternoon thunderstorms, and those don't tend to overwhelm the soils as much. They just go to evapotranspiration, or they just evaporate.
Right. That makes sense. Can you touch a little bit more on the groundwater recharge? There's something there about how water flows through snow as well that creates these really focused points of meltwater discharging out of the snowpack into the soil that makes it particularly effective for groundwater recharge, right?
Yeah, so we can think of that as, if you think of it, all this snow on the side of a mountain or on a hill slope, a lot of that water will tend to run off and not necessarily interact with the ground until you lose that slope. And so in these low-lying areas where there might be little ponds that form underneath the snowpack while it's melting or something, when you get that accumulation of water in a location like that, it tends to just push a lot more water down into the groundwater systems.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. So next, I'd like to talk about the big elephant in the room, climate change, and specifically on what effect increasing global temperatures is having on snow. Can you list some of the important climate change-induced trends in snow across the United States?
Sure. I think the main one is kind of what we touched on a little bit, is that transition to rain. So more precipitation is falling as rain as opposed to snow, like it normally would if it was not a warmer environment. And that tends to happen a lot more at our lower elevations. So lower elevations that used to accumulate snow more often or for a longer period of time during the winter, it's now seeing more rain and less snow. So our winter snowpacks are kind of moving up in elevation to where they're not as extensive across the mountains and ultimately not accumulating as much snow. And then also with it warming up, we're starting to see our runoff occur a little bit earlier. So the snow is melting earlier, and that changes how the system is able to produce that runoff or the efficiency at which our watersheds are producing runoff. There's a lot of uncertainty as far as how that's going to affect runoff when it changes a lot. But in general, right now, our systems are set up, like with our reservoirs and our water management system, it's set up for that later runoff to be able to store that runoff until we need it in the hotter months like July or August. And so as we get early and earlier snowmelt, that's becoming more and more of an issue of how to manage that water.
So considering what we talked about earlier, can you talk a little bit about what these future predictions of snow and a warming climate mean for these communities that traditionally depend on snowmelt water?
Sure. So I think as I just touch on a little bit, as that season of storing the water in our reservoirs becomes longer because the snow is melting earlier, and the high demand doesn't change as much. Farmers still want their water during the peak growing season. We still want to water our lawns in the cities and things like that in July and August. But as we increase in population, we're going to want more and more water. As that season of storage in reservoirs gets extended, reservoirs don't tend to be the most efficient, savings accounts essentially for that water. So you lose a lot to evaporation. Some of that's still going into much deeper aquifers. We're losing a lot through that storage mechanism. So as that demand is increasing because of increasing populations, because of warmer summers and all of these, accumulating effects, we're also getting less snow melt. It's coming off earlier and maybe less efficiently. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there, where higher demand but less available water from snow.
Right. There's one last point I wanted to bring up in terms of climate change. When we talk about climate change, it's often important to also talk about variation, both across space and over time. Many places obviously won't experience the same effects of climate change. And there's also a lot of annual variation in weather that's not necessarily a result of global warming either. Can you just quickly touch on how variable are future predictions for snow that you were just talking about in the United States? Are there some areas that are going to be more impacted than other places? Some areas maybe that are less certain what the future holds?
Sure. So I think in general, the variability is projected to increase. So we're expecting, when we get a huge winter, it's going to be really big, and when we get normal winter, it might be less snow, and then there will be even worse case scenarios when we just almost get no snow in certain areas that used to get regular snow. So I think that variability is projected to increase. We're certainly seeing some of that occur already, but in general, we're seeing that the snowpacks are declining over the years and over the many decades of snow observations. It's on a steady decline. Some areas are still seeing slight increases, but not very many. And we are actually seeing the snow season to start a little bit earlier as a result of climate change. So there's a little bit more variability in when the snow season starts. The only issue is the ground is really warm now, which is it's not allowing that snow to start to accumulate. So the accumulation in the mountains still tends to be about the same, but we are seeing snowfall slightly earlier because there's just more water vapor in the atmosphere.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So doesn't necessarily mean less snow, but kind of a changing of the dynamics of when that snow falls, when it's melting, how much is staying on the ground, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's tough to say, specifically what's going to happen. You can't make a blanket statement about how things are going to change everywhere. Right. It's causing a lot of variability in many different places. So I think the only thing we can be somewhat certain about is that things are going to change everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to quickly recap for our listeners on what we've just been talking about. So with climate change, it may cause less snow to fall in the winter. It's going to cause more annual precipitation to fall as rain, and it's going to cause snow to start melting earlier. All of this is going to make things harder for communities that depend on snow to budget their water resources, which means getting good estimates of how much snow water exists in the basins around a community and when that water is going to become available for those communities is becoming increasingly important. Can you first quickly talk about the traditional techniques that are used to quantify snow water in a region?
I think in the Western U.S., the most common method that people know of is called the SNOWTEL network. So that's really just a collection of weather stations that also have things like snow pillows. So it has a scale that weighs how much snow we have on the ground that we can use to actually observe how much water is in that snow. And then there's also things like snow courses where people actually go out and they just poke a bunch of holes in the snow. You just measure the depth of the snow and take snow cores to see how much liquid water they'll get from that when that snow melts. So it's a lot of pretty local measurements, a lot of point-based measurements from the weather stations. And then even when people are going out, you can't just walk a transect or ski a transect across an entire mountain range all the time to measure all the snow. So it's still pretty localized measurements of how much snow we have.
Right. What are some of the limitations of these traditional tools? I know we've been measuring the water equivalents of snow through snow-tell sites and these snow surveys for quite a while. Meanwhile, things are changing pretty rapidly in terms of snow distribution and amount of snow, like we were just talking about with climate change. Are there limitations of these tools that are becoming greater as things are changing?
Yes, absolutely. So, back when we first started making snow measurements, we could go out to a location, take a bunch of snow measurements, put a weather station in, and say, okay, there's this much snow on April 1st, and that would correlate really well to how much stream flow we would get throughout the runoff season. And as things vary more and more, that doesn't tend to hold up as well. And a lot of that is because of just the natural spatial variability of snow. So if it's a low snow season, or some of those lower elevations are slightly warmer, they're not below freezing anymore, they're just above freezing, and they're getting rain instead of snow, then we're changing when that water's entering the river. And so we're altering how that runoff is happening. And a point that we're measuring snow higher up is just not going to represent it as well. Also, if weather patterns change slightly, and the accumulation is just occurring in a more variable way than what we've seen before, or in a different pattern, then it's also all of a sudden not as accurate to use these point measurements. So what we've been seeing is that those point measurements work great when, a very normal, quote unquote, average or quote unquote normal snow season happens. But as soon as you start to stray from that, or if you get a few dry years followed by a normal year, then the effects of those dry years accumulate more than what we would normally get for runoff, and it affects how much we're getting in the river. So we're just seeing, as variability increases, these traditional measurements are not holding up as well.
Right, but obviously, like we were just saying, those understanding the snow water resources and basins that affect communities is very crucial and increasingly crucial. So what current research efforts are going on to kind of improve our ability to monitor and plan those snow resources at a scale that's fine enough to kind of respond to the very increased variability that we're seeing with climate change?
Sure. So I think there's a lot of efforts going on. I think there's a lot of communities and agencies that are interested in this. There's a strong remote sensing snow community. So folks that are trying to figure out how to work with NASA data to get better observations from space. There's huge campaigns with that, as well as the Bureau of Reclamation that manages a lot of the reservoirs in the Western U.S. is trying to figure out how to better forecast the river flows from snow. And so I think what we're seeing right now is a big push for improving our technologies at estimating how much snow are in our basins. And I think the community is in general agreement that there's no single solution. So no one type of satellite is going to solve our problem. So we're really looking at what combination of information can we best use to get at that issue of how much snow do we have in our mountains. And I think that'll be a combination of different radars from satellites or lasers, as well as modeling and what information can we use to improve our modeling efforts. And that's coming a long way and coming along quickly. So I think in the next few years, we're going to see some really nice data sets coming out in almost real time of how much snow is in the mountains to be used for forecasting and for water managers to improve their forecasts and improve how they do their job, hopefully.
What's out there right now? Are there any free or maybe even paid resources that are available for water managers that involve some of those more sophisticated technologies for monitoring snow resources in a basin or multiple basins?
So the NRCS tends to put out some snow forecasts, or snow basin estimates at the larger scale. That might not be the best for some of the small communities. I think the small communities are still some of those data are kind of lacking just because of the large extent between the stations that we were talking about.
Right.
So I think that there are ways to get more involved. There's things like the community snow observations, which is communitysnowops.org or mountainsnow.org. There's a couple of just citizen scientist opportunities for people to get more involved in observing snow, going out and making relatively simple measurements that'll put forth towards these larger efforts. And that'll also just, I think, help people get a better understanding of what's going on in their local basin. So I really encourage folks to get out there and poke some holes in the snow and see how deep it is in different areas and just see what your watersheds look like.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for sharing those resources. For anyone listening who is interested in taking a closer look at any of those tools and websites that Ryan just mentioned, I'll be sure to include some links to all those useful resources in the podcast description, so you can check them out. But I think that's about all I have for you today, Ryan. Thanks so much for talking with me today. And I hope our listeners have a new appreciation for snow research, and the impact that declining snow resources will have on many communities around the country, including, of course, many small systems. Ryan, do you have any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to leave with the audience?
Sure. I'll just kind of add a couple of things. I know we talked kind of a lot about sort of this doom and gloom of climate change, but I think that, there's a lot of hope, right? There's little things that everybody can do. Just kind of looking at the water footprint of the products we use, and then getting more involved in our local communities. I think that this is one of the things where we can think global but act local. So just getting involved in our local cities and townships and community efforts, and ask the local governments, what is the plan for water resources? Where are we going to get our future water resources? And start talking to folks and getting more involved. And I think that is ultimately the way to go. And I think more and more communities are starting to come up with those plans, but it's important to get those in place before, all of a sudden you go turn on your tap and water doesn't come out. So
right.
Starting to act a little bit more conscientiously, and I don't think it's as doom and gloom as sometimes it's made out to be. I think there's definite hope, and we can figure this out. So
for sure, and that's why it's important to be having these types of conversations now and talk about climate resiliency, right? Like what we need to do to face these challenges, because we do have a lot of tools at our disposal.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this episode about climate resiliency, the challenges of a future with less snow. You can learn more about Ryan's work at webbhydrology.weebly.com. You can follow us, the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, and the Environmental Finance Center Network on social media. You'll find us on Instagram and LinkedIn. This podcast and other EFCN podcasts are available on all major podcast platforms and our website, efcnetwork.org. Thank you, and I hope you can join us for another episode.
Thank you to all our listeners for tuning into this episode of the EFC Network podcast, brought to you with support from the U.S. EPA. Be sure to stay tuned for future EFC Network podcast episodes.